I believe you all know as a student of DeCaroli, so I don't need to go deeper into much introduction. Maybe just lecture or lecture, yeah. We can't have like an hour and a half, or 90 minutes, or 1 year or so.
Probably about right. Well, thank you very much, Joyce, especially. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is a real pleasure and an honor to be here. I have been working on a number of things this semester and last semester as well. Working on a book project right now. We'll see if by the time we get to the conversation at the end, we can bring some of that material in. But last semester, one of the things that I was working on was an extension of a paper that I was asked to write for a journal a couple of years ago. It was a special edition on the subject of life, and I was asked to do something on Agamben. And so thinking about what approach, because there's many ways one can approach the question of life in Giorgio Agamben's work, of course. What I decided upon was to look at life from the point of view of its political manifestation. So to try and understand a political form of life, what that might mean in Agamben's work. And in the process of doing that research, one of the things that struck me and continues to strike me about some of the more recent work of Agamben's is sort of subterranean or sort of the understated importance of the role of the idea of necessity. So I decided to follow that path and see where it takes me, where it took me. And the work that I did on this subject was mostly on the state of exception. But as I started working on the topic last semester, trying to extend it a little bit, it appeared to me to be a really nice way to also understand the highest poverty and what Agamben is doing in that work. They're very different works, but I believe that they are absolutely run in parallel with each other. So one of the things I'd like to do today is sort of explain what I see as part of that parallel, extend beyond that in Agamben's work, and particularly in the direction of another term that appears obviously in this text, and that is the idea of poverty. So we'll start with some of my own research and background into this question, sort of setting the stage for the conversation, and then look specifically at the state of exception, and then I guess spend a little even more time on the highest poverty. Okay. And please feel free to interrupt the questions. We have plenty of time ahead of us, so there's no rush for time whatsoever, so which is wonderful. So the first thing I'd like to start with then is what I think has been a long-standing connection between necessity and violence. That there's a link that bonds these two concepts. And the history of political thought is a testament to this. Because if you go back to, say, Aristotle, we find that before the good life of politics that's promised by politics can be made possible, the resources necessary for biological life must be secured. You cannot have a political order until the biological order is satisfied. For this reason, Aristotle dedicates the first book of the Politics, in fact, to the oikos, to the household. And, of course, the oikos in the household is the site where biological necessity is taken care of. It's the place dedicated to securing those things, the food, the shelter, the clothing, necessary for bare life, for pure life. But in addition to providing the necessities of daily living, the oikos also serves as something else, and there's a strategic function that it serves in Aristotle's Politics, because it serves as the background against which the polis will be defined. Sort of the starting place against which then the polis will become something different. And in modern times, we find the same formula echoed in the state of nature, the 17th, 18th century political theorists. Establishing the state of nature, which of course, as you all know, is that hypothetical time before the formation of society, before the formation of a political order, in which each person independently seeks to satisfy his or her own necessities without the mediation of law, without the mediation of government. And it's in the state of nature, in this concept, the state of nature, that the modern period exposes to us something that was merely implied in Aristotle, and that is that link between necessity and violence. Because as is absolutely well known, the state of nature is linked to the violence of the war of all against all. So it is the necessity that appears in the state of nature that leads us to an unrestrained violence. The state of nature, of course, is not only the site then of permanent biological demands, but it's also the place of what Hobbes calls the right of nature. And the right of nature is that essential right whereby everyone is permitted, not by law, but by nature, to try to acquire the needs that they have for their own survival. And in that case, then, there's a justification for violence in the pursuit of what is necessary. But whatever the case may be, and there's many different formulations in which one can present, it's always true that biological life burdens living beings with the most profound sort of necessity. And the word that we use to describe this necessity is the word survival. Survival is the name we give to our confrontation with the necessities of existence. And why I think it's important to linger a bit on this term is that to survive doesn't simply mean to live. To survive means to outlive, from its Latin root, to overlive, actually. And in surviving what we outlive or what we outlast is, I'd like to propose, necessity itself. So what it means then to survive is to stay one step ahead of what is biologically necessary for our own existence. But as long as one remains exclusively within the domain of the oikos, that is, within the domain of pursuing survival, mastering the necessities of life will involve exposure to risk and the risk of violence. Because, and this is another, I think, pivotal point, that every necessity conceals the potential for an emergency. Every necessity conceals the potential for emergency. So if what I need is to have a certain amount of water each day, and if at some point the water supply gets polluted or gets turned off, I confront an emergency very quickly. So the risk there is always that without us foreseeing it, we will encounter the conditions of emergency because we are always biologically linked to the needs of survival. Now, with regards to the polis, so this is the oikos, no, with regards to the polis, I think what we mean by the polis, what Aristotle means by the polis, is only fully intelligible insofar as we understand that it is a response to the potential of an emergency. The polis arises as a response to the potential of emergency because by marking out a space in which necessity is no longer permitted to rule, that is, by erecting a juridical order as a buffer against the natural order, the political community seeks to evade necessity. The aim of political life is to avoid necessity. Politics in classical Greece was, therefore, founded in opposition to the demands of living. and in classical antiquity, whereas life in general, and this includes animal life, was characterized by necessity, the highest expression of human life, zoon politikon, was distinguished by a uniquely political manner of living, which was, strictly speaking, unnecessary. So what I'm saying here is that if biological life is understood as in its immediate relationship to the necessities of living, and if the political life of the polis gets established against that backdrop, it gets established to distance ourselves from those biological needs which are necessary, and as a result, political life is in one way or another an unnecessary life, very intentionally. It is that which remains unnecessary. Now, at this point, we could perhaps assume that we've come to a kind of conclusion. There's kind of a fundamental understanding that positions the oikos in opposition to the polis, and that the polis solves some of the problems that the oikos brings to us. But I think that would be very much a mistake, and I think it's a mistake for two reasons. First, and these reasons both explain why I think that the separation between the polis and the oikos has never held fast. That hope to keep necessity at bay is never actually satisfied. The conditions are never there to satisfy that separation from what is necessary. And I think this happens for two reasons. The first is that the polis never exists without the necessary work of the oikos. Even politicians need to eat. This kind of thing. And second, because the logic of political life generates powerful necessities of its own. Even though it's trying to distance itself from what's necessary, the political order begins to generate necessities. And I'd like to look at these then one at a time. And then after this, we'll look at state of exception and cosmology. And see how I think these ideas are being employed in Agamben's work. So far we're not in Agamben territory. Okay? This is sort of the precursor to the discussion. So first of all, the domain of life has always, from time to time, erupted within the polis. That is, the demands of life have always, from time to time, appeared within the polis. That is to say, from time to time, the necessities confronts the juridical order, and when the need for survival confronts the aims of politics, the force of law begins to deteriorate. So for Aristotle, as we know, and somewhat notoriously, not all members of the community were members of the polis. In fact, it's a very small number of people who were the members of the polis proper. The members of the polis were limited because the existence of the polis was made possible only through the exclusion of those whose lives remained tethered to the labor required for survival. And in this category, we can group slaves, women, right? Those people who were not full participants in the civil order. And so, given this distinction that Aristotle's make, it's not surprising that it is from out of the ranks of those individuals that the political order first encounters its antithesis. That is to say, the political order encounters the poor. Because what I'd like to suggest is that what we mean by the poor is the name that we give, the poverty or the poor of is the name we give to the appearance of biological necessity within the borders of the political state. It's not by accident, for instance, that in Book 2 of the Politics, Aristotle states quite explicitly that, quote, poverty is the parent of both revolution and crime. Pause for a minute on this. I think we can understand some of the subtlety that Aristotle is dealing with here. These are not synonymous terms. crime and revolution are very vastly different things, and Aristotle is well aware of this. Because beyond a certain point, poverty no longer simply leads to crime, right? And we can think of many ways in which poverty leads to crime. In fact, so much of our criminal justice system is just supplanting the poorhouses of the 18th century. We simply put people in prison as opposed to putting them in poorhouses, etc., etc. So poverty is very much a part of the criminal justice system. And so when one is poor, one finds oneself exposed to certain needs, and when one is exposed to those needs, one will, for instance, steal a loaf of bread. Right? This is a crime. But that at a certain point, poverty leads not to crime, but to insurrection. Leads to the undermining of the very legal order that makes crime itself intelligible. Because we do not have crime unless we have viable laws. Criminality is the consequence of law. Law doesn't follow crime, it leads crime. The appearance of criminality is the result of the drafting of laws. And that at a certain point, poverty, because of the necessity, begins to undermine the validity of the legal order, leading to its demise, potentially. And this is why Aristotle refers to it as being akin to both criminality and to revolution. So, poverty then is the antithesis of the political because it introduces necessity into the domain of a form of life that has historically been defined by its absence. This is a point which is borne out repeatedly in literature, classical literature. And I'll take a couple examples to make the case. So, in a classical author by the name of Alcaeus, we read that Penia, who is the Greek goddess of poverty, is characterized as being ungovernable. Quote, Penia is a grievous thing, an ungovernable evil, who, with her sister, helplessness, lays low a great people. Unquote. So that's from Alcaeus, and then I think even more profoundly, Herodotus, in his histories, speaks of the story of a Greek general by the name of Themistocles, and Themistocles who commands the inhabitants of a small island called Andros to give him all of their money. But having no money to give, the islanders respond in a non-negotiable way. Here's what they say. They say, quote, since we are in the hands of these gods, poverty and helplessness, we will give no money. All the power of Athens can never be stronger than our inability. There's something very essential about understanding this little narrative. Confronted by the law, by power, inability remains stronger. And I say this knowing that there's a sort of irony to this, but the people of Andros could respond to Themistocles by saying, we are in fact stronger than you, because our inability makes any command you give to us completely unintelligible. It renders it, to go to an Agamben terms, inoperative. There's an inoperativity that is exposed when power confronts inability. And I'm mocking inability here in some ways, associating it with poverty. So in both cases then, impoverishment is presented as a type of necessity, which being both ungovernable and undefeatable, commands an authority that lies beyond the reach of the juridical order. Now in the pages of Hannah Arendt's On Revolution, we find an equally instructive encounter, in this case here, an encounter between poverty and the state, that's framed by the ideals of the French Revolution. Here's what she says. Poverty, is abject because it puts men under the absolute dictates of their bodies. That is, under the absolute dictatorship of necessity, as all men know from their most intimate experience and outside of all speculations. It was under the rule of this necessity that the multitude rushed to the assistance of the French Revolution, inspired it, drove it onward, and eventually sent it to its doom. For this was the multitude of the poor. When they appeared on the scene of politics, necessity appeared with them, and the result was that the new republic was stillborn. Freedom has to be surrendered to necessity. That's the end of that quote. So, just to sum up then this first discussion, when biological necessity surfaces within the border of the state, it does so in the form of poverty, and there is simply no law which can be written that is severe enough to prevent it being broken in circumstances where what is necessary is either scarce or unavailable. Okay, so this is the first way in which that separation, the presumed separation between the polis and the oikos, remains incomplete. Always you find that there is the necessities of life appearing within the polis which tries to prevent those necessities from coming. But they do appear. Now, second, the second way in which this separation reveals its fragility has to do with the appearance of a necessity within the political order itself, not one that comes from the outside, from the oikos, but a political necessity that is born of political life itself. Kind of political survival is at issue. The violence that political life sought to avoid by excluding necessity from its domain reappears in the form of necessities born within the political order. It is a purely political form of survival. The survival of the state is not entirely, nor even necessarily, aligned with the survival of the poor, but is rather dependent upon preconditions that make the rule of law possible. So my argument here is that what we mean when we say the survival of political life, what we mean is, what are the conditions under which law is possible? That's sort of the bedrock that you need to establish a legal system, a political system. And so we can find this, I think, very quickly and very easily when we turn to Carl Schmitt and his very famous statement that every general rule demands a regular, everyday frame of life to which it can be applied, and further, that no rule is applicable to chaos. I think in these statements, what he's referring to is precisely the preconditions which are necessary for political survival. Since the law can only exist under conditions that permit the source of its authority to go unquestioned, the primary work of politics is not the imposition of law, but the maintenance of a stable, coherent order within a community such that the logic of a legal system, once it has been created, will be capable of giving commands that are regularly obeyed. That's the system that the legal order depends upon for its own function. The entire survival of political life rests on the ability to make command possible by making obedience normal. And so, whenever this preconditioned frame of life, to use Schmitt's term, is placed in jeopardy, the state, facing its own kind of death, takes emergency action. When political life then appears on the verge of collapse, the political order then begins to mirror the biological order, starts to do a very similar kind of thing. It parallels the biological order insofar as it calls upon extrajuridical legitimacy to preserve the life of the state through the use of violence. Just like when the poor ran into the problem of acquiring the necessities of life, the law was no longer an obstacle. A force may be an obstacle. It can always come in, the men with guns can always come in. But the authority of the law in the face of situations in which one's necessity begins to disappear. And the same thing happens in the state. When the state begins to witness the appearance of threats to its own survival, it begins to mimic what the biological order does by circumventing its own law, by taking extrajuridical action. And of course, the whole history of the state of emergency or the state of exception appears out of this background. So just as in the case of biological survival, necessity introduces the potential for emergency action. But this is really the important difference. But at this point, the parallel between the biological order and the juridical order comes to an end. So there's a parallel, but it stops at a certain point. And I believe this is why it stops. It stops because whereas life enters a state of emergency whenever objective conditions give rise to the risk of death, hunger, for instance, the state enters a state of emergency strictly by way of a decision. There's nothing objective about what it means for the state to run the risk of its own death. This is not something objective. You don't have the same kind of objectivity you do when you run the risk of dying of hunger. And so it is the decision that someone, and of course Schmidt referred to this as the sovereign's primary responsibility, will declare the state, the survival of the state as it is. And it's that declaration that gives legitimacy to what follows, which is the suspension of law and the creation of a state of emergency. But you see, this is very, very different. One is a decision, one is not a decision. So, okay, so this is sort of the background that I was mentioning we'll get to before we start talking specifically about Agamben's text. But I think this work helps us to understand the role of necessity in these two texts. So we reach a kind of fork in the road here, which I believe this fork in the road is reflected by the two books that we're going to discuss, because both of them are concerned with a kind of necessity. And first, we have the state of exception, which I'll discuss in a minute. First, which explores what happens to politics when the state of emergency is declared. And in this case here, that book is very much concerned with the idea of authority. What is authority? How does authority, what lasts beyond the suspension of law? How is that possible? And second, the highest poverty, which explores, and quote from Agamben, explores explicitly, quote, the possibility of human existence beyond law. So, this next section here, we'll look at the state of exception. Obviously, there's much more in this text than we'll be able to talk about here. But I do want to look primarily at two things. One, this notion of the justitium, the state of exception, the suspension of law. And then, secondarily, look at the idea of continuity that appears within the state, that passing from one sovereign to the next. So in the state of exception, Agamben introduces this feature of Roman law called the justitium, which was designed specifically to respond to situations in which the survival of the republic was in danger. And as I'm sure many of you know, not all of you, the way it did this was to call upon Roman citizens to use whatever means necessary to defend the state once it had become clear that the law no longer could. And what made this possible was a complete suspension of the law, what he refers to as a juridical vacuum. And Agamben's chief concern, or his interest, is in the legal status of acts committed at a time during which the law is suspended. How, in other words, does the command to preserve the state by means of any action whatsoever survive and remain in effect in the absence of a legal framework? Not only is it entirely unclear how the command remains in force, but it is equally uncertain as to the meaning of obedience in this situation. To what would one be obedient? The general term Agamben uses to name this lawless space is, of course, the state of exception, but he also makes it clear in that text that synonyms to this state of exception, this terminology, abound, and most of them, if not many of them, if not most, have emergency in their phrasing. So we hear of an emergency decree, emergency power, the state of emergency. So when the law is suspended, and let me just say something here. I think, Agamben's use of the state of exception, it has its own strategic function in his own work, insofar as he's interested in exceptionality. It's also more aligned to the translation of Schmidt's texts. But whenever we read state of exception, we read also state of emergency, I think we get a sense of the compelling nature of the emergency that leads to the suspension of law, because it attaches it much more to this relationship between necessity and violence that we started with. So it helps to understand what's going on when we think about it also in terms of an emergency. So when the law is suspended and the state of emergency is declared, what you see is political life beginning to imitate biological life by claiming the legitimacy to act outside the law when its survival is at risk. All of the extreme measures taken when the political system has entered a state of emergency are justified entirely on the grounds that they are necessary responses to necessary conditions. But as we've seen, what it means for necessity to appear within the state has nothing to do with an objective encounter, as it does concerning biological survival. Instead, political necessity is the result of a subjective judgment regarding whether or not an emergency has occurred, and I think perhaps even more importantly, a subjective judgment over whether or not the current political system is worth saving at all. And this is where insurrection comes in, right? If political existence is at the risk of death, well, for many people, that's a great thing, because it involves the possibility of a new political order. So, unlike biological survival, which is pretty objective unless you want to see you at the end of your life, which is fine in some cases, but typically speaking, people want to preserve their life. In the case of the state, that's not the case. Many of us would like to see a different political order in existence, and so when survival ends up putting the state at risk, there's opportunities there as well. So there's much more that can be said about this, but including, for instance, what it means for political life to survive. What does that mean? And I think here we have to recognize that political survival has nothing to do with biological survival. And the reason I think we can state this pretty categorically is that the state has always reserved the means to terminate political life without ending biological life, that is, to terminate citizenship without terminating life. The history of banishment and exile testifies to this point very explicitly. So in DeCaroli, for instance, I'll just mention one. There's many, many quotes that we could marshal in the service of this. DeCaroli says, for instance, that in the case of exile, quote, "The citizen dies, the man only remains, and with respect to the political body, the death of the citizen should have the same consequences with the death of the man." So you can kill off that political life by ending the privileged status that they might have, by removing their status. And you can find many, many examples of this. Bob mentions it, many mentions. But the political life of the citizen is different than the political life of the sovereign. So there's two forms of life within the necessities. One, your sort of average political life of citizenship and the status that grants one. But then there's also this sort of important and middle kind of life that is occupied by the sovereign. Because political authority resides in the body of the sovereign. Agamben says quite a bit about this in The State of Exception. And it's in this sense that we read that the king is, quote, a living law. So far as the king is indistinguishable from the law that he pronounces. And it's for this reason, it's because the king personifies authority through his actual body, and because authority must remain in effect if the juridical order is to remain legitimate, that the entire history of Western political power has been consumed by the problem of continuity and by the development of strategies for ensuring it. The death of the king, in other words, must be managed by rituals of continuity so that the authority vested in the king's body literally outlives, that is to say, survives, the end of his biological life. And of course here immediately comes to mind is Kent Horowitz and his notion of the king's two bodies, whereas, again, I'm sure you know, the king, an effigy, a wax effigy, was created of the king so that which sort of bore the political life past the death of that other king's life, which dies and gets interned in the grave. That political life lives on in this effigy. So if biological death is the most certain of all biological necessities, in other words, we need to eat, we need to drink, but one of the things we all must undergo is death. So death is, if biological death is the most certain of all biological necessities, then the capacity to extend political life by surviving biological death is undoubtedly the greatest triumph of the political sphere. Being a living law, the sovereign makes the political emergency possible by making political necessity intelligible. And therefore, what we encounter in auctoritas and authority is a manner of being rather than a manner of doing. And all questions concerning authority are at their base ontological in nature, kind of a political ontology, or even a social ontology that's at work here. And I think more and more we start to see the way in which Agamben is coming closer to sort of explicitly talking about the nature of social ontology and the potential for undoing social ontology. This is maybe something we can talk about later, but I think it's important. I think it has everything to do with his discussion in The Time That Remains about the Pauline as if, right, or as if not. It's the reason why in the title of this paper I talk about as if by necessity. There's something about that as if that makes it, it opens up a certain kind of potentiality. But we'll talk about this in a minute. So, for these reasons then, we can understand, I think, and it's pretty obvious in that text, that necessity is really at the heart of what motivates the conditions under which something like authority in political life generates the capacity to exercise its own, justify its own use of violence in support of its own survival. But now I'd like to reframe the question of necessity. I'd like to move from the state of exception and that sort of brief discussion of it to look at monastic rule in the highest poverty, and then turn from monastic rule in general to the vow of poverty in particular. So the highest poverty opens with a discussion of the birth of monastic rule in the 4th and 5th centuries. And these rules, Agamben emphasizes, are not juridical texts, but rather they're codes of conduct that effectively reconfigure the relationship between norm and life. So they're not, strictly speaking, legal. What is rule, he says, is a quote. What is rule if it is completely joined to a way of living? What is human life if it can no longer be distinguished from that rule? Unquote. Now, this formulation which appears repeatedly throughout that text, I think invites us to compare it rather directly and explicitly to the relationship that the sovereign maintains to the law, which we saw in the state of exception. It mirrors that text in a pretty interesting way, an evocative way. Because there, of course, Agamben undertakes a study of sovereign authority that makes life indistinguishable from law, not rule, but from law. So sovereignty blurs life and law insofar as he is a living law. And now we have in this text the notion of rule and life being blurred in monastic contexts. So I think there's an intentional parallelism there. So likewise, monastic rules are not laws in the strict sense, as we've said, but neither are they merely advice that leaves the monk simply at liberty not to follow them. And here again, I think we can hear another echo of how authority is described in the state of exception. And in particular, I'm thinking of the way it's described by Theodore Mommsen, who's a Roman historian that Agamben cites repeatedly. And Agamben cites Mommsen's definition of authority, and his definition is this. He describes it as more than advice and less than command. So authority is more than advice, less than command, an advice which one may not safely ignore, which seems to me to parallel quite closely the discussion of rule as being not law on the one hand, but neither just simply an advice that the monk can ignore if they feel that they choose. So we find then this conspicuous parallel between rule and authority, and thus a parallel between the two texts. And so whatever monastic life turns out to be, it is opposed to law, which is precisely why, as I mentioned above, Agamben tells us that the purpose of his book is to determine, quote, the possibility of human existence beyond law. Rules, not unlike authority, are not law and do not attain their efficacy through juridical means. Rather, they are guidelines, they are indications and general forms of counsel which first and foremost indicate a way of living. Agamben speaks about this at some length, drawing from many different sources, one of which I think is very clear is from Thomas of Serrano, who writes that he who professes the rule does not vow to observe all the things contained in the rule, but he vows the regular life contained in them. Hence, in certain religious orders, precaution is taken to profess not the rule, but to live according to the rule. Unquote. There's a subtle distinction being made here. That one doesn't follow the rule, they follow the life that the rule records. We'll talk about this further, but I think this is really important. What rule seems to be here is the textual form that reflects a way of life that has, through experience and through practice, been shown to be an efficacious life. That in the experience of people gathered together in a community, in this case in a monastic setting, at certain points, some group of people will say, this is a good way to do things. And that oftentimes gets formalized. And the formalization that it takes is the form of a rule. And there will be some common values that the group feels are really definitive of who they are, and these become things that then a new person takes a vow to support and to follow. But the risk in any kind of formal formulation of a rule or of a way of living is that the rule will seem to be paramount to the life. The rule will seem to stand above the life and guide it. But Agamben's point here, if I'm understanding him correctly, is that in fact it's the other way around, and we must understand it the other way around, that it's the life that gives form to the rule, not the rule formed to life. Rule does not impose itself on a life. It is the result of a way of living. And if we keep that in mind, then the rules, if we practice a way of living that that's appropriate with regards to rule, we prevent them from becoming dogmatic. It's the dogmatism that's the risk, turning these things into something more real than the life that they simply reflect. Because once we turn something into a kind of dogma, a kind of litmus test, a kind of measure of worth, then we always find ourselves beholden to the rule. And the more people practice obedience to the rule, the more they have something to gain by seeing themselves and measuring themselves in relationship to other people vis-a-vis the rule. And the stronger that becomes, the more concretized that becomes, the harder it is to change. And I think at the end of the day, what something like rule offers, don't turn it into a dogma, is the ability for the rule to change given changes in circumstance, so that the specific sort of situation becomes what takes precedence, not the universality of the rule or law, but the particularity of the situation and the encounter, so that it's okay to break the rule, as long as the circumstances demand that rule as long as we recognize and make the judgment that the rule doesn't fit that circumstance. So this is, I think, an important thing. There's a long history in legal thought that I'm particularly interested at this point around the notion of equity. Equity in Aristotle is a virtue that stands above the virtue of justice. And it stands above the virtue of justice because what equity is a response to a particular situation, a judgment about a particular situation that recognizes that the application of laws, rules of justice, in this instance, would produce injustice. So Aristotle fully understands that justice can produce the most unjust consequences if it is followed religiously. And so equity stands as a way of softening the universality of the rule. I think there's something to be said about the relationship between what Agamben is saying and what Aristotle, for instance, says in something like equity. So if law joins the juridical order to those individuals subject to it, so we're all subject to the law, then rule, instead of joining the obligated to an elevated order of authority, rather bonds together each to each those who have given themselves over to this obligation. So it's less hierarchical. It's more horizontal. The form of life invoked by the rule is precisely a common life. The rule doesn't stand above the community it coordinates, but is rather an immanent order fully entwined with the life that it coordinates. Common life, Agamben writes, quote, is not the object that the rule constitutes and governs. Rather, it is common life that makes rule possible. Flips the causal relation. In other words, the rule is not applied to a pre-existing life, but produces that life and at the same time is produced in it. There's a reciprocal nature, a kind of cyclical kind of nature to the way in which rules maintain themselves in relationship to the community that they guide and coordinate. And what is followed when one follows a rule is not just the text, not just the vows, and not just the precepts, but rather a way of life. And the easiest way to think about this example is to think about it in terms of the religious nature of exemplarity, which of course monastic communities of all kinds are sort of based around. And that is in Christianity, the life of Christ, within Buddhism, for instance, the life of the Buddha, not to mention the manner in which a community serves to exemplify its own behaviors to itself. So we learn from each other. Each of us are teachers to the others. But in all cases, what is absolutely crucial is that the model never be permitted to become transcendent. Because in doing so, the logic of sovereignty and law is re-engaged, and we are no longer operating on the level of the rule, but rather on the level of command, which I think we can understand a little bit now, Agamben's tactic with regards to profanation, and why profanation becomes such an important part of defaming and desacralizing those things which have been made sacred. Or put another way, the form of life expressed in the rule and adopted through the vow is simply its exemplarity. And so, for instance, simplicicus severius writes, this is again a quote that Agamben uses, be a form of life for all, be an example. That's the quote, very short. Be a form of life, be a form of living for all, be an example. So, the great insight then, I think, of monastics was to refuse to produce on top of a common life, which is always somewhat unstable, a legal framework that purports to protect it, stabilize it, and defend it. Because the cost of this stabilization, that is, this desire for a kind of permanence, is a legal logic that permits political life to appear, and with it, the potential for emergency and violence that we've discussed. It starts to re-engage that political kind of life. Now, this is the more or less last section here. There's one other thing I'd like to just bring to your attention at the end. But now, for those people who choose to live according to monastic rule, they mark that transition from a regular life to a monastic life with the vow. And for the Franciscans, an essential vow was, of course, the vow of poverty, and that's what Agamben is focused on. But what distinguishes Franciscan poverty is its insistence that what is renounced through the vow is not simply ownership, but the right of ownership, thereby effectively separating ownership, which is a right, from the use of a thing. And I think, and Agamben makes it, I think this is the most brilliant part of the book, is this difference is monumental. Because with this gesture, the Franciscans neutralize the law with respect to life. Since right derives from laws, and the abdication of rights is equivalent to the abdication of law, and here, as Agamben explains, the abdication of rights, quote, and the separation of ownership from use constitutes the essential apparatus that the Franciscans used to technically define the peculiar conditions that they called poverty. So circle back around to that question of poverty in relationship to this question of rights. He quotes Bonagratia, who's speaking about what it means to use without right, and it's a very simple and clarifying statement. He says, as the horse has a de facto use, but not property rights over the oats that he eats, so the religious who have abdicated all property has the simple de facto use of bread, wine, and clothing. Thus, the particular form of usage open to monastics who have renounced the right of ownership is here framed by necessity. It's framed by the necessity of that horse who wants to eat. And as we've seen early on, because necessity marks a certain legal limit, a threshold beyond which the legal order not only loses its authority to command, but is rendered superfluous to the demands of life, it, I think, affords Franciscans an opportunity to reconsider the relationship between law and life, and to realize the existence of human community absolutely outside the determination of law. And it's not quite as explicit, but I believe this is sort of where the logic that Agamben is putting forward comes from. It's that necessity that makes the poverty of the Franciscans radical, with one caveat, which I'll get to. So, thus, as we've seen, since poverty is the name given to the appearance of necessity within the political order, it's not surprising that it is in the name of poverty that the friars minor conceive of a new way of living. Now, if we turn to the Capuchin Constitution, this is a text from 1536. It's a text which, somewhat surprisingly, Agamben does not cite or reference in the book, but it's a text which was absolutely central to the development and a historical expansion of the Franciscan ideal. We read in this constitution, this religious monastic constitution, that all use is understood in terms of necessary use. And I'll read a short sentence from this text. It reads, "Let every friar remember that evangelical poverty consists in the firm resolution of not becoming attached to any earthly thing, of using the things of this world most sparingly, as if compelled by necessity." End quote. Now, what I think is most powerful about this statement is not just that it links use and monastic use to necessity. In other words, the use of the monastics is driven by, the legitimacy of the use of things is driven by the necessity of that use. But in particular, the use of the term "as if" by necessity. So here I think it's important to make absolutely clear that neither the Franciscans nor Agamben is suggesting that when one vows poverty, takes a vow of poverty, one is not also vowing starvation, right? I mean, when you take a vow of poverty, you know that you're not vowing destitution and the risk of starvation, but rather the vow. I think this is my understanding of it anyway, is that the vow of poverty, when you take a vow of poverty, what you are vowing is rather the willingness to survive in the absence of ownership. Survival in the absence of ownership is what the vow of poverty seems to me to reflect. This is not Agamben's words, but I think we can make some sense of it. The vow of poverty taken by the monastics is simply to use as if usage were compelled by necessity, because necessary use is a form of use over which the law can claim no jurisdiction. Monastic poverty, then, must not be equated with the poverty of destitution, but should be understood as the basis for a manner of consumption that has weaned itself from the habit of operating in terms of property. Not to mention this notion of infinity, or this infinite accumulation that property law enables and encourages. So Franciscan poverty, in some level, and there's much more that can be said about this idea of accumulation, but I think Franciscan poverty is framed as the conceptual opposite of accumulation, and what it means to accumulate things in their legal form, which is, after all, where the origin of property in the West arises, and particularly I'm thinking of Locke. So this notion that one can legitimately accumulate infinitely. But unfortunately, our general perception, our perception as we're raised as children, has been so thoroughly inscribed by the law of right that the ontology that we learn as children is an ontology of property relation. For the Franciscans, the point, it seems to me, is to train ourselves to perceive the world beyond the ontology of property rights, including, and in this sense we see how social ontology plays its role here. We learn how things become property for us. One of the things that I have done in the past when I teach some of this material, not the Agamben material, but just talking about property in general, is in the course of my lecture, I'll walk around the front of the classroom and walk up and, maybe take a cup or something from somebody and bring it up to my front desk. And immediately the reaction on the part of the students is one of disbelief. What did you just do, right? As this, right? And of course, all I did was move an object from here to here. But it's very clear to all of us, not just from the person that I took it from, that that object has a particular ontological relationship to somebody not other than me. And that there are regulations, social and legal regulations, barring what I can and cannot do with regards to the use of that object. And so if I were to move this here, no one would think anything of it because it's mine. But think about how complicated our relationship to our world is, to this room, in which all of us instinctually, just as surely as we can open our eyes and perceive things, we more or less know, just looking around, what object belongs to whom, what object I can touch and no one will have a problem, what object anybody can touch, what objects I ought not touch or use. This is an ontological status that these objects bear with them more than any other kind of ontology. Certainly in our world that is so governed and overwritten by the rights of ownership. This characteristic of these objects, these ownership characteristics, are ones that we give to the objects as a community of people who share a kind of an understanding of ownership. And that can be undone, that can be rendered inoperative, not easily. But what the Franciscans are engaged in is a practice, and I say that very explicitly, a practice, not just a set of principles, but a practice, a way of getting up every morning and thinking, training yourself to think differently about your relationship to the world and the objects around you. So they're engaged in a community that is vowed themselves to think differently about their relationship to the objects, their relationship to objects in the world. And that seems to be where the vow of poverty becomes, finds its real weight. It's not simply, the vow of poverty is not simply an expression of piety. It's not simply, oh look, I love my God so much, I'm not going to eat. I'm going to eat very little. No. There are certain understanding, I'm sure, that comes along with that, but I think this is an impoverished, no pun intended, an impoverished understanding of that use of poverty as a vow. It's much more radical than that. And so the Franciscans then are asking us to train ourselves to perceive of a world beyond the ontology of property rights, including, and this is extremely important for I think for Agamben and for all of us, is that these property rights, or these rights, include intangible things as well. Intangible possessions, such as rank or status. In all these cases, what I think we need to train ourselves to do, which is excruciatingly difficult in our world, is to know when we have had enough. To know what is enough. I don't think there's been enough work done on the philosophical implications of the concept of enough. What that means. It's a very hard thing to measure because we assume a kind of infinite accumulation. Many of us can say, okay, you know what, I don't need to become wealthy because I enjoy what I do. But what about status? What about privilege? We can register this with respect to gender, with respect to race, with respect to intellectual status. All of these things whereby we measure our own privilege. The Franciscans are asking us, I believe, to step back from that and recognize the degree to which these things can cause harm. And it's precisely for this reason that the Franciscans insisted, and Francis himself insisted, that his disciples be called minors. The order was known as the Friars Minor. And minority here refers to the evangelical disposition not to seek the first place. not to wish to be above or more powerful than others. That is, to relinquish privilege. I mean, after all, I think for any of us who have studied the sort of asymmetries of power related to gender or related to race, what I think any advanced understanding of this has to come to terms with is not simply the bringing, for lack of a better word, and this is crude, bringing people up. That's the easiest part with respect to our own sense, for those of us who are sitting in privileged positions in our own cultural traditions. The hard part is giving up. Giving up privilege is at least half the project. It's not just helping people up, giving people status that they don't have, it's also being willing to relinquish privilege that we have. So, although the Franciscan model, I guess I've mentioned this here. In having renounced all property, every right of appropriating property, the Franciscans nevertheless retain, this is sort of getting to the conclusion right here, nevertheless retain, because it is unrenounceable and therefore ungovernable, they retain the natural right of use that arises from necessity, thereby confronting the legal order with precisely that which the law can never prohibit and therefore can never govern. What we have here is, in effect, I think, what we might call juridical poverty, which cannot be characterized as either illegality or austerity, but is rather a form of life characterized precisely by its ungovernability. And thus, to live according to a vow of poverty is not simply to adopt a life of frugality and abstinence, but is also, or at least potentially, an intervention and a political practice exercised in the service of creating a community premised on neither law nor on sovereignty. And I think this is the direction that Agamben is heading with this work and potentially its future work as well. So let me formally end there, and I don't know if it's appropriate to take the break and we can come back and talk, and then okay. Thank you.